Hey, it's Louise Hvala and you're watching another episode of Gatehouse Insights. Today I'm joined by Joel Backwell, who is the Executive Director of International Education at the Department of Education and Training. Joel, thank you for being here with me today. We've been trying to organise this for some time, so we've finally made it happen.
Pleasure.
Before we get into the details of your career, I wanted to begin with something you're very passionate about, and that's your strong relationship and connection with Indonesia. Can we dive deeper into how that began and how it's become so strong?
I studied Indonesian at high school and was very lucky to get a scholarship to go on exchange when I was year 10, so about 15 years old. And I lived for 2 months with a host family over there and completely fell in love with the place. The people, just the natural beauty of the place. And so I guess ever since, whether it was at study or in career, I've always looked at opportunities to get back there. So I studied Indonesian as a major at university, and when I applied for law firms, I only applied to those firms that had an office in Jakarta, and I've worked there on and off ever since.
And how was that experience working in Indonesia as a lawyer?
It's a very different place. I mean, basically it's got a very different legal system because it's based on the Dutch civil law system. So it uses a lot of statute rather than legal precedent. But the real difference is the same as any other country, that the legal system is not something that sits over here. The legal system of a country is based on the society, the norms, the will of the people. So there are many aspects of the Indonesian legal system that are very different to ours. In practical terms, they've still got courts and judges, but for example, if you're a graduate coming out of uni, you choose to be a judge or a lawyer and you follow that career for your life. Whereas here, most judges start out as lawyers and then over time, usually barristers, they then take up a profession as judges. So a lot of elements are different, but really it's the underlying culture of the place that's most different.
And something you're also very passionate about is the, I suppose, culture and aspects of Indonesia. For those in our audience wanting to upskill and learn more about Indonesia, what can they do and what programs are available to them?
Go there. I think the best way to get to know a country is to go there. I mean, you can read a lot of books about the place, but the benefit of Indonesia is it's so close to us. Flights are cheap. You can get to Bali for not much. Although if you do want to learn about Indonesia, please don't just go to Bali. But there are a lot of programs that you can participate in. There are programs run by organisations like Achichis, which does scholarship programs, or the federal government's New Colombo plan has really generous scholarships for Australian young professionals to go and spend some time studying and living and working in Indonesia. So it's not actually that hard at the moment, thankfully, if you want to be able to get one of these programs or scholarships and spend some time over there.
Now take me back to the start of your legal career, looking at your first position and the progress through and the position you hold now.
So it's safe to say it hasn't been a linear career path. So I didn't want to be a lawyer. When I was younger, I really wanted to be a paediatrician. When I was, again, in about year 10, obviously it was a seminal year for me. I read The Justice Game by Geoffrey Robertson, and I don't know, something really clicked. Something in that, his book about the stories of defending the little people and working to help people navigate through a system. So I think after reading that, I decided I wanted to do law, and particularly something in human rights, work for the UN or maybe for the International Criminal Court. So all through university I had that in mind. I volunteered for Amnesty International. I studied a lot of human rights law. I did my honours thesis on human rights NGOs in Indonesia. It's probably another example of that crossover between law and Indonesia. And I had this idea that with that all behind me, I'd now go off and apply for jobs at the UN. But towards the end of uni, I thought, partly to pay off HECS debts, I should probably get a job that paid first. So I applied for all of the law firms that had offices in Indonesia, again combining the two. I thought I'd do articles, get qualified, and then go back to the game plan. But I ended up really enjoying corporate law. So I got articles with Freehills, now Herbert Smith Freehills. And I think I was just lucky, right place, right time. So they did have a Jakarta office, which meant I got to do a lot of corporate work in Southeast Asia, Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore. But they had a really passionate, inspiring pro bono partner, a guy called John Emerson. So through him I was able to do a lot of pro bono work as well. We took cases to the ACCC, we ran a homeless person's legal clinic, we did mentoring for at-risk school kids, and then also got to work on the Bali 9 case. So in the end, if I look back to that sort of 7 or so years that I worked with Freehills, I got to do the human rights and pro bono work that I was passionate about, and got to do some really interesting corporate work as well. I think that was partly due to one of the partners I had, a guy called John Tivy. So threw me in the deep end from day one, gave me a lot of responsibility. One stage put me on a plane to the Philippines for a week as a first year lawyer to run a due diligence. So just a lot of opportunity. So I did that for about 6 or 7 years, and I think it got to the point where I found that I was more interested in the policies that were generating the issues that brought companies to us to give legal advice than I was in the actual legal advice. So then I decided to make a move, give it a go anyway, to the public sector.
And you're now in the at the Victorian Department of Education and Training. Can you tell us a little bit about this role and what day-to-day would look like for you?
Sure. I can't tell you what day-to-day would look like because every day is literally different. But so I'm the head of the International Education Division in the Victorian Department of Education. So we basically do 3 things. One is we manage the International Student Program, which brings international students into Victorian government schools. International education's our biggest services export, and that's a big part of that. The second is what we call internationalising education, which is basically making sure that our local kids have global learning experiences, learning second languages, going on exchange, interacting with people from other cultures, because we know that the jobs that they will do in the future will be global. So part of our job is giving them that global skill set. And the third piece of work we do is international engagement. So that's engagement between our department and foreign governments. So for example, when our Minister, the Deputy Premier, travels to China, we support his travel and feed into a lot of the policy outcomes that come out of that.
And how have you found your legal skills have helped you in your current position?
So I think legal skills is an interesting term. I wouldn't say legal skills, but working in a law firm, particularly a firm like Freehills. So we do a lot of procurement, we're dealing with foreign governments, so there's often legal risk that we have to assess or maybe get a law firm in to work with us on. So having that legal background is really helpful there. But I think beyond that, it's things like attention to detail, thinking your way through problems, networking. Networking's a really, it's a soft skill that you develop working in a law firm that a lot of people in the public sector aren't as comfortable with, but it's something that you can bring to a public sector role. Complex negotiations, working across teams. There's a whole lot of skills that I've taken from a legal career that have been really, really helpful in this role, as opposed to there being legal skills or public service skills. I think a lot of the skills are interchangeable.
And having both worked in private practice and government, how did you find the transition between private practice and government?
Tough, really tough.
What were some of the struggles you faced?
I've said this to someone before, that the concept of culture shock, I thought I experienced culture shock when I went from Australia to Indonesia as a 15-year-old. I think I had more culture shock when I moved from the private sector to the public sector. So a lot of things are the same. Whether you're a lawyer or a public servant, you're negotiating, working with people, solving problems. But so for example, in a law firm, time is money, which means decisions have to be made quickly you can't afford to go through 6 layers of decision making. Whereas in the public sector, you're almost obliged sometimes to go through 6 layers of decision making because it's very risk averse, which is kind of ironic given that as a lawyer your main role is to manage risk. But I think that aversion to risk is one big difference in terms of the impact it has on the way the organisation carries out its day-to-day. Another difference is the hours. So I mean, there are times where I've worked long hours in this job. For example, when the minister goes to China, you know, you're on 24/7. But at Freehills, you would work sometimes till 2 a.m. every day for a week without blinking an eyelid. You would pull an all-nighter because the whole team did. And looking back, I remember at the time thinking, this is nuts. But I don't know, you get an adrenaline rush and there's a real team sense and camaraderie when you're doing something like that. It would be very, very rare to see someone pull an all-nighter in the public service, or at least in most of the areas that I've been involved in. So they're probably 2 significant differences.
You mentioned before that you were part of the Bali 9 team, and I think it was for 9 years. Can you share some of your experience being a part of that team?
Sure. So the Bali 9 case was easily the most fulfilling but most challenging thing I've ever done. Inspiring, heart-wrenching and everything in between. So I'd been working at Freehills for about a year, and Julian McMahon and Lex Lasry, who were the original lawyers on the case, they gave a talk about the case and basically a shout out to anyone who had legal skills but also spoke Indonesian. And I remember my housemate Rachel came home one night from that presentation and mentioned it to me. So I emailed Julian the next day, and I think within 2 weeks I was on a plane with him to Jakarta to try and meet some Indonesian lawyers to try and engage some of them to help with the case. So I guess originally it was a chance for me to use my Indonesian understanding and law, and that was, you know, really cool. Got to get on a plane, go and work with Julian McMahon. But it very quickly became a lot more than that, and particularly when I met Myuran and Andrew and their families, just 2 of the most amazing individuals I've ever met, and I know ever will meet. So it became much more of a passion and you know, something I ended up doing almost out of friendship rather than a legal case. It was an amazing experience getting to navigate the Indonesian legal system. We took a case all the way to the Constitutional Court and literally missed out by 1 judge out of 9 on overturning the death penalty in Indonesia. We were that close. But every step of the way we were always that close. And in the end, in fact 2 years ago, last month, they were both executed. So we put our heart and souls into the case, and I don't know what we could have done differently, but it still hurts like hell. But I guess on the positive side, Indonesia has unfortunately not stopped, but at least reduced its executions over the last few years, and at least it's created some debate around the use of the death penalty, and particularly for drug cases. But I think for me, it had a lot of impacts apart from just being emotionally challenging. One was it really emphasised for me the importance of understanding other cultures. I mean, Myruan and Andrew weren't killed by the courts, they were killed by politics. So it wasn't the legal system that put them to death, it was a society that still looks that way upon drug criminals. But it was also partly the reason I left the law, because as a lawyer you're negotiating cases based on the law that exists, whereas if you get into government and public policy you can actually shape the policy before it even gets to the courts. And I think having sort of beaten our head against the wall so many times through the Indonesian legal system, I think it just got a bit much in the end, and that was one of the reasons I went into government policy. I think as a lawyer, particularly corporate law, you work for months on a case, and if you win, there's a company and a whole lot of employees that benefit. But in public policy, I'm doing things now that impact on, hopefully positively, tens of thousands of people, particularly students here and overseas. Yeah, I went to an exhibition of Myruan's recently, an art exhibition, with a lot of the legal team, and it was amazing seeing the progress that he'd made as a human being. And I think that's another thing that was really a positive to take away from the legal case was, if we hadn't been involved, I think he would have been executed very quickly, because it went through 3 courts within a year. But when we got involved, at the very least, by going through that process, running all the appeals, it gave him a lot more time than he would have had. In the end, nearly 10 years, when it might have been 1 or 2. And in that 10 years, he was able to, you know, grow as a human being, do all these amazing things in prison, and go from sort of a petty criminal to someone who's now inspiring other people through the legacy that he's left. So particularly for anyone who's doing criminal law, I think that's a really important thing to remember, is you're often not just their lawyer, and they're often not just your client, but you develop this personal relationship as well. I think that's a really important role that lawyers play.
How did you see him change from the beginning when you first met him to present?
He always had an inner strength. He was a pretty quiet guy, really pensive, really thoughtful. I think in the beginning he was quiet because he was spending a lot of time reflecting on what he'd done and the impact it had on those around him, and feeling probably worse for his family than he was for himself. I think over the years he stayed thoughtful, but started turning those thoughts to, how can I do something positive? How can I make a positive impact? And you'd always see him sitting at the back of the room in these art classes and looking at all the other inmates and thinking about what else he could do to improve their lives. So he ran art classes, he got Ben Quilty in, and they built this amazing workshop in the prison. But he also ran a whole lot of other things, first aid courses and computer classes and graphic classes, and just, he would have been an amazing businessman, I think. Just his ability to build up all of these different opportunities for all of the other prisoners. And if they'd let him live, he would have just grown into, I think, an amazing artist. But at least in that time, he did turn into someone who could be proud and could see the pride of those around him, which he wouldn't have had if it had only lasted a year or 2.
I wanted to touch on something you wrote in one of your posts on LinkedIn, which was, I'm one of the lawyers who represented Andrew and Myruan for more than a decade before they were executed on 29th of April 2015. Easily the worst day of my life. Can you talk more about this experience, that day?
I can, if I must. So Myruan called me the night before he was executed. I was living in Malaysia at the time. I was the Trade Commissioner to Malaysia and Brunei. So it was quite difficult then working for the Australian government while still being involved in the case and having to be really careful about avoiding conflict of interest and perceptions. So towards the end of the case, I was involved more in a personal capacity than a legal one. And so I'd been speaking to him on and off, and I'd been there a few months before, just before he got moved from Kerobokan prison in Bali to where he was finally executed in Java. And so he called, and I'd been told by Julian that he was hoping to call, but you never know. And I still remember when the phone rang and it was him, and we sort of got about 2 minutes to talk, and I mean, as he always did, it was always about making other people feel okay, not about himself. So he sort of, I don't know, cracked a few jokes and then just said thank you for everything that I'd done. And I just remember the phone call ending and kind of collapsing back on the couch and just not really knowing what to think or feel, because by then we knew, we still hoped there was some chance, but by then we'd literally done everything that we possibly could. And yeah, I think I just probably sobbed myself to sleep that night. And then yeah, around midnight he got shot. It was horrible, actually. I mean, horrible for me because I'd had this chance to really get to know this amazing person, but I think more horrible for Julian, who was actually there at the time, and Veronica and their families. I mean, I could never comprehend to this day what his family would have been going through. Just indescribable.
Thank you for sharing, because we're not a part of it, and so having someone provide their personal experiences is really good to know and be aware of, so thank you. You're also very passionate about arming young Australians with skills to engage the world. Can you provide your top 2 skills that you think every young Australian needs?
Sure, that's easy. That's why I took this job. So when I worked in Malaysia as the Trade Commissioner, I kept working with all these Australian companies that were trying to export to Malaysia and other parts of Southeast Asia, and they had great stuff, whether it was services or products, really good value, high quality products, but a lot of them failed. And it wasn't because of the quality of their service or product, it was because either the head of the company or the workforce just had no understanding of how to work in different cultures. When Myuran and Andrew got executed, it was partly because Australia and Indonesia don't understand each other very well. So to me, taking this job was kind of a response to both of those frustrations and making sure that we are creating a generation of Australians, or in my case Victorians, who can address some of those shortfalls. So in answer to your question, 2 things that I think particularly young people need, whether they're going to be a lawyer or a public servant or anything else, is a language other than English and intercultural intelligence. By intercultural intelligence, I just mean an understanding of and respect for other cultures, other ways of doing things, empathy basically. And the reason why that's so important for young Australians in particular is because, firstly, jobs are global. If they're not now, they will be. You'll either be working for a company that's exporting overseas, or a multinational global company, or a small company here that's got inputs coming in from other parts of the world. So if this next generation wants to be able to get those jobs, they need to be able to engage with the world and have this intercultural intelligence that they will need to be employable. But the other reason why it's really important for this next generation to have intercultural intelligence is because, having spent a lot of time living overseas, one of the best things Australia has is its multiculturalism. So if we're going to keep having this wonderful, vibrant, multicultural society where people respect each other, understand each other, even if they've got different religions or political views, we need in our young generation to have a whole lot of people that have this empathy. And I think intercultural intelligence, learning other languages, seeing things through others' eyes is one of the best ways to build that up in our society and keep it there. Because you look at things like Trump and Brexit and it feels like a bit of that is fading away, but I think Australia's got a real opportunity to keep leading in that space. And it's why so many people want to come here, because it's a vibrant place, it's an interesting place, and it's because of the people that we have from all over the world that have made Australia their home. It's funny, we have all this talk about migrants taking our jobs and refugees, but apart from Indigenous Australians, none of us were born here, or at least our ancestors weren't. So I struggle to engage with that debate, to be honest.
I agree, because my parents and grandparents are from overseas in Europe, so they weren't born here either, so I totally agree. What are your future dreams and plans for strengthening the ties between Australia and Asia? Because I know it's something you're very passionate about also.
So I'm in the right place at the moment. I think free trade agreements are great, and businesses doing business is very important. But in the end, I think the thing that's going to strengthen the relationships between Australia and Asia are going to be the people-to-people relationships. It's going to be the young Australians going over to Indonesia under a New Colombo Plan scholarship, or primary school kids learning a second language, or some of the exchange programs that we're running. One of them is amazing actually, the Victorian Young Leaders to China program. Sends Year 9 students for 6 weeks to China, real immersion learning, understanding culture, building language and leadership skills. So if I really wanted to strengthen those relationships, I'd stay in this job for the rest of my life. Given I've never stayed in a job for more than about 4 or 5 years, that's unlikely. But hopefully what we're doing at the moment to really build up the international engagement piece of what we call the education state in Victoria will lay a lot of those foundations. But I think building those relationships is something that needs to happen not just in jobs like mine. I think it's everyone's responsibility. So the other part of what I'd really like to do is work with businesses in the private sector to increase their understanding of why it's important. And a lot of people spend their whole life in either the private sector or the public sector. I've had the benefit of doing both. So one thing, for example, is I talk to parents and ask them, why don't you encourage your kids to learn a second language? And they say, well, why would I? How's it going to help them get a job? And then I talk to CEOs of companies and they say, why isn't the department doing more to make sure that the employees can speak another language? And they're not working with each other. So for example, it'd be great to have CEOs of companies go to parent councils and talk to parents, or go on TV or write articles in the paper about why they think that this next generation needs to speak other languages and have intercultural intelligence and be comfortable engaging with the world. Because otherwise everyone's just talking in a little bubble and the message isn't getting across. So what I really like is staying engaged with my old networks in the corporate sector and continuing to remind them of why they need to play an active role in doing what I'm doing, about lifting that level of awareness about this, why this is important. And I think the other thing to remind people is, and I mentioned it before, it's not just about the economic imperative, it's a social imperative. So it doesn't matter who you are in Australian society, if we have a generation that has a greater appreciation of other cultures, we'll all be better off. We'll be living in a more harmonious place, and we'll also be better off economically. So it's win-win-win, but it's everyone's responsibility, not just those whose title have international education in them.
Joel, thank you for being here and sharing your insights.
Pleasure.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
You're welcome.
Now, Joel and I would love to hear from you. What is the biggest insight you're taking away from today's conversation? Comment and share below and let us know. If you like this episode, please subscribe to our channels and share this video with your friends. And thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time on Gatehouse Insights.